It's the 315. Here's Brian Higgins.
All right, here we are rolling along on this Wednesday in the Q's. Judah update. Nothing yet from Judah Mintz. 6 hours and 44 minutes until the end of our endless watch. We'll know something. Oscar Sheboy, though, is officially going pro. John Calipari is officially distressed. He does not have a center. He probably has 7. I don't know. His recruiting class is really good. I feel he'll get over it. Anyway, let's get to our next guest. He is Bruce Feldman of Fox Sports of The Athletic. This morning had an oral history entitled Syracuse Football Was Once a Beacon of Success and Innovation. Will that remain a memory? As we bring on Bruce. Bruce, when I saw this come across my Twitter this morning, I knew I was in for a weird nostalgia, like half hour or so. That, man, I'm telling you, that hit Syracuse fans in all the right and all the wrong places at the same time, I think.
Yeah, that was the reaction I got from a lot of people as the story started to get around. And, I'd worked on this probably for a good month, and I knew I had, because I grew up in upstate New York too, and so I knew the history well. I don't think, somebody's covered. I mean, I didn't cover college football till the 90s, but I remembered I had a buddy who was actually on the team that that was on the 11-0-1 team. Mm-hmm. And so I knew the history well, but I always felt like that Paul Pasqualoni and George DeLeon were really underrated and overlooked by a lot of people outside of maybe the actual coaching profession, like people who are either high school coaches or just football coaches in general. Have great reverence for them and how they worked, how they developed relationships and everything like that. But I just feel like a lot of people missed the boat on how good this program was for a long stretch of time.
Specifically with those two. And I think, if you're around the program and whatnot, you've heard stories like that, and maybe different ones than the specific ones you told in the story, but they kind of jibe along the same angle. But, that stuff is not stuff that comes out when you're watching a game, right? How do you think maybe those two can get viewed a little differently now, I guess, historically, when you see the reverence they are held in by, you said it, it's high school, it's college, and I'd say I would extend up to NFL coaches, too.
Yeah, my recollection on a lot of this from I have a lot of buddies who went through Syracuse, either went to school there or, that's where they kind of worked their way through the media, was, especially those two guys are old Northeastern guys, maybe come across as curmudgeon-y. And so sometimes those guys are going to get their due maybe for what they were on the cutting edge of what they did scheme-wise and how good they were actually at developing coaches. And so to look back, you think of all the coaches who've come through there. Jeff Stoutland, who was a young coach there and learned under those guys. This guy now largely considered the best line coach in all of football. Mm-hmm. He was the offensive line coach for the Eagles. I talked to Ed Ogeron for this story, who was a long time considered the best defensive line coach in football. And he has great admiration and respect for Paul, especially because of what he did for his career. And so you had a lot of these guys who worked in this environment and learned how to be at their best, how to develop and teach and everything else. But I think lost in that probably was just how good of the talent they had. You're talking about a great run of quarterbacks, really starting with Don McPherson, who almost won the Heisman, and then it goes to Marvin Graves, and then obviously it goes to Donovan McNabb. But just the level of talent that came through there, and really, as Paul said in the story, they did beat Penn State for Marvin Harrison, but by and large, it was a lot of guys who maybe for one reason or another were not very coveted recruits, but guys they knew because of how they had their camp system, and it was a different era back then. But so much was the relationships with the high school coaches, and it was just that's the story I felt like I really wanted to tell in here. I did a piece a year or so ago when George DeLeon had passed, because I knew a lot of coaches, especially high school coaches, how they felt about him. And I didn't think that enough people really in the football world or the fans really had a great sense of that. And in a lot of ways, this story felt like it was an extension of that, because it talked about the program itself and how they develop people. But, in the context of, as you said, it's bittersweet because it's now a long time gone in terms of, when from Darryl Gross became the AD and he hires Greg Robinson, who was a total outsider, and then the program just kind of lost its way. And I feel like it's been that way for a long time, and there's a lot of factors that we kind of get into in the story and of how it lost its way. And then the issue ultimately is, can it someday get back to being what it was, or to some degree what it was back, with Coach Mack, and then certainly with Paul running the program.
And I guess, and Bruce Feldman is our guest here. The question is, and obviously so much specific stuff went into building, and you mentioned the relationships. I'd say like George and Paul probably had a specific relationship with almost like literally every high school football coach in New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Like they'd show up at any of those schools at the drop of a hat. The question now for Syracuse would be, I guess, Bruce, like even if you tried to replicate that, like, does that work in today's age, or is the game changed in so much that you kind of have to find a different way into things if you're Syracuse right now?
I think it would still work if you had the right people involved. After Robinson, there was a part where Doug Marrone was there, and obviously he had deep ties both in the area and to Syracuse. And he started to get a little traction, but he didn't stay there that long.
Right.
And then he moved to the NFL, and I think, Dino's certainly done some good things. Dino has a dynamic presence. And I think the challenge, though, is, and one of the former Syracuse assistants said this in the story, was I don't think the formula is going to work when you're trying to out Florida State, or out Clemson. They're going to get better players than you consistently. It's just the margins are not good enough. Whereas the model that really worked for them was let's cultivate and develop those relationships so strong that we are getting the guys that maybe is the 3-star guy in this day and age, but you develop them and they're going to send that player to you. I mean, there's a story that I was going to run, and we ultimately didn't have room for it on Marlon Greenwood, who obviously turned out to be almost had a decade in the NFL.
Yeah.
But the coaches told me about how they kind of found him was he was at a high school. He was, a standout wrestler and soccer player, and got talked into playing football basically midway through his junior year. And that coach, Russ Sullivan, had called Pasqualoni, and I don't think he had a guy at that point. Pasqualoni's receptionist basically said, I got a call from Russ Sullivan, and Paul was like, okay, he must have a guy. And that was kind of the dynamic there. And you just don't hear about that anymore in a lot of, corners of college football. And I still think that can work, but it takes time to build a program and to maintain it. And I don't know if eventually there's a new head coach there with ties to that area and has a real, understanding and a real awareness to do some of the things and to work it the way they did, I think it can still be effective. I think you can still have, top 25 teams, but I don't know if you can have the level of success that they did, because as was talked in the story, there was the time when those really elite dual threat quarterbacks, they were going really to one of two places. They were either going to Nebraska or they were going to Syracuse. And then at one point, Michael Vick was committed to Syracuse, and then obviously he didn't end up going, and he stayed home and went to Virginia Tech. But, I mean, those guys were such difference makers, and I don't know if that's the part I don't know if you can get. To me, it's like now everybody wants that quarterback. But back then when they were rolling, most of those schools, most of those power programs weren't really in the market for those quarterbacks. And so while I think they can be really good that way, I think it's going to be harder to get your the superstar quarterback consistently. But you know what? There's guys out there. It's just they got to work to go find them and develop them.
Yeah, it's a whole different world. And I found this, and Bruce Feldman is our guest here. What I found interesting here the last few years, speaking of Dino, one, it looks like they're working hard to, reestablish those connections back in Jersey here, at least more extensively the last couple of years. But two, on the quarterback front, and I found this very interesting with what Dino's doing, is now the quarterback room is basically exclusively SEC transfer quarterbacks, where it's almost like if you're Syracuse, right? Well, they're going to get all the 4- and 5-star guys. They can't all start there. You almost might as well wait and go get your guy after the fact.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, I feel like that's what a lot of schools are doing. I think one of the things that's interesting, and this came up with, when I talked to Chris Rippon, who was a longtime Pasqualoni guy, around Syracuse, and he had talked about Keith Bullock, who obviously was a first-round pick and left there, as one of the best players who's come through there. But he said when he first took over as defensive coordinator, he was like, he was a safety, and I was like saying, I want to move you to linebacker. And he said, I know he wasn't happy about that at first. In this day and age, does that kid say, all right, you know what? I'm gonna listen, and I'm gonna do what they think is best for me and keep developing, and it's gonna work out in the long run? Or does the player hear that and go, you know what, I'm gonna go somewhere. I'm gonna move now and go somewhere where I'm gonna play. I get to do what I want, where I feel like I'm most comfortable. And I don't. If that is. A lot of assumption goes into that. It was like, okay, this is a different kind of player, and maybe they just, in this day and age where the transfer portal makes it harder to develop guys and maintain them for the long haul, where, a lot of those Syracuse guys, they were developed and maybe 3 years into 3 and 4 years in, and then maybe they were real, role players by their 4th year in the program, and then by year 5, they were starters. I don't know how many guys in this day and age would stay for that.
Yeah, it's a waiting game, and people don't want to play the waiting game, at least not at their first school. Maybe by the second you realize you kind of have to do it, but it's a whole new world. And Bruce, we spent a lot of time here in the last few weeks, and I'm sure you've been on it too, like the conference realignment stuff, and I don't know what the ACC was doing a few weeks ago, but for an afternoon anyway, it felt like you're on the brink of implosion. How does that affect a school like Syracuse, where you're not necessarily in your natural region anymore? You're doing that. The league you're in is playing catch up to these other two leagues. How do you think a school like Syracuse needs to navigate these waters? And really, is there anything they can do to do that with football in mind at this point?
I think the only thing they can really do is just try to lock into what their identity is, because I think it's so hard for these programs where you get caught up in the rumor mill, right? Mm-hmm. You look at right now, the hottest topic in college sports, or at least college football, is what's going on with Colorado, right? And is CU going to leave the Pac-12 and get moved to go to the Big 12? Well, 9 months ago, CU football's been horrible for a long time. But now that Deion Sanders is there, all of a sudden now there's intrigue. We did a story just today about how all the networks want Deion and that team, even though they've had, talk about the transfer portal, they've had a massive roster overhaul, unlike anything college football has seen. But the point of it is, all of a sudden now, because he's there, and who knows how long he'll be there. He may only been there like 2 years.
Right.
Who knows? But all of a sudden now, that's the big talk, is what's CU going to do? Are they going to leave? Are they going to, And I just think if you're a coach who's trying to build a program, you got to keep in mind you can't chase every rumor. I feel like it's, ultimately, if you're going to sustain success, and a place like Syracuse, I think, especially at least with a football program, I mean, in a basketball program, if you have 3 really good transfers, you can make a big splash in a hurry. In football, it's not going to work like that. So I think, however you're going to do it, what mattered for them, and when Syracuse was at its best, they really played the long game in terms of, it wasn't going to happen overnight. And I feel like that's what they're going to have to do, because if they end up getting caught like chasing their tail because they're not at the front end of where the ACC is, they're not Clemson, they're not Florida State, they're not Miami, or they're on the other side of it, they can still be really good. But I just think it has to be a commitment, and hey, this is what our identity is going to be, and we're going to stay with it. I mean, Wake Forest has turned out to be a pretty solid football program under Dave Clawson. I think because he knows what they are, and they really work to it. But they're playing the long game, and I think that's the best they can hope to be because that's how he's doing it.
And Dave Clawson, ironically, a New York State guy. So go figure how that all comes together at this point. But Bruce, great to chat. I'd say thank you and curse you as well for the nostalgia from this morning, because that took us on the emotional roller coaster of going back to the good old days, of the 90s with football. But thanks so much for the time today, Bruce, and we'll have to do it again soon. Okay.
Hey, lots of fans would be jealous to have at least been as good as Syracuse once was.
That is a fact.
At the very least, with that, you can always say, hey, if we did it once, we can get back to it.
That is the hope. That is certainly the hope. All right, Bruce, thanks so much. And everybody out there, be sure to check out Bruce's article on The Athletic. Well worth the time to check that out today. This is Bruce Feldman of The Athletic and of Fox Sports here on, it's basketball and football colliding today. We're talking transfer portal. We're talking NBA draft. Football schedules and game times are coming out, and we're going back to the 90s, getting lost in the nostalgia of McNabb to Brominski and the whole deal. The whole deal. Marvin Graves. I love me some Marvin Graves back in the day. Love me some Marvin Graves. Find Bob Casula somewhere he can tell you about recruiting Marvin Harrison. That was the big one. Kadri. Where's Kadri at? All right, we'll take a break. Thanks to Bruce Feldman of The Athletic. Good to chat. A fun article to read this morning. Not one I was expecting. Like, that was one that caught me completely out of left field today, but let us turn the tide of the day a little bit. We'll take a break. We'll come back, a little 4-on-1 in the 315. When we come back on this hour, brought to you by Burdick BMW. We're back after this. It's QSportsTalk.com and ESPN Radio.